Hello there everyone, this is Mr. Brass, and this is the beginning of my new series on the Inquisition, where I'll be going over the history of the Inquisition and the Church, along with other things. The reason I'm making this series is, like the rest of my series, to educate and clear up misunderstandings about the time period. Well, hope you're gonna enjoy that. This is all for today. This is Mr. Brass saying goodbye and get wise. Hello there everyone, this is Mr. Brass, and today I'll be going over the part 1 of my series on the Inquisition. In this video I want to give a laydown of some of the context of the time of the Inquisition. While the term Inquisition today will get you images of brutal torture, in its days it was marked by its leniency. The term itself just comes from the Latin to mean to inquire, which describes what the Inquisition actually was, i.e. an inquest. The Inquisition represents when the medieval world became more administrative and ordered. It followed an updated form of the Roman law legal methods. Church organization, like most institutions, started off small and grew to be complex. The apostolic foundation showed the making of the church, as the apostles organized the church through an initiation process of baptism and ritual meal. They were given loose but binding authority and preached to cities and joined different Christian communities. Bishops located in different towns and were to be the successors of the apostles so that there could be a lineage. This was done on an ad hoc basis, which makes sense when you consider the whole organization of the early church was situated on the belief in the end of the world was coming soon with Christ's coming. After the apostles became old and they started doubting Jesus was coming back soon, they made a more ordered system. When the apostles died, the communities began wondering what to do and what was moral and stuff like that. The Gnostic heresies basically said that Christ had bestowed special knowledge on them, which was against apostolic foundation. Ignatius of Antioch said to give power of interpreting scripture for truth from the bishops. In the 3rd century, bishops of provincial capitals were seen as the oversights of other bishops due to efficiency, and were now called archbishops. The Council of Nicaea archbishops in Rome, Alexandria, and Antioch were considered the patriarchs of the church, with one archbishop who came from Rome. This was due to their appeal to Jesus' call to St. Peter. St. Peter didn't establish the church as they believed, but rather was an early leader. Peter in the Gospel of Matthew 16 verses 18 through 19 had been singled out as an authority, they argued. The Bishop of Rome, Clement, in the 90s recognized that the bishops of Rome could assert authority over Christian community. Irenaeus in the 2nd century confirmed a sort of papal authority. Pope Damasus, who was the pope for 366 to 384 AD, also confirmed how popes had authority through Peter, and through that period papal pronouncements and judgments over time became like imperial degrees that the emperor would give out. The Pope became more important in the 4th and 5th century when Rome began facing problems, and after that the church grew in concurrence of the Roman Empire. After Emperor Constantine's conversion in the 4th century, Christianity grew massively, and by 400 virtually everyone in the Roman Empire was a Christian. Instead of becoming the head of the church, Constantine just worked on helping the church as he believed he was called to do so, by first dealing with heresies, but since he was no priest, he referred questions to the Pope in Rome. He wanted to deal with the Arian heresy by bringing forth the Council of Nicaea so they could resolve scriptural issues and come to conclusions on the truth of Christianity. He really didn't deal with matters much and wasn't a part of those religious meetings, as again he was no priest. He let them sort it out. Constantine's relationship with the church was that similar to secular systems, as it showed state and the church were two separate entities that could work together for common aims, but that's it. This was odd back then, because usually church and state were the same. This ties into the Inquisition because it shows the different aims of the church and the state. In the end, the western half of the Roman Empire would collapse, but the eastern half would continue to flourish. The reason for the collapse was namely due to politics and the economy. Christians communities would lose a lot of members when Muslims in the 7th century invaded Christian areas, with all that remained was the Pope in Rome and the Patriarch in Constantinople. This would be the birth of the Roman Catholicism and Eastern Orthodoxy, and thus becoming the main pieces going into the Middle Ages, which the Inquisition itself is a product of. Well, that is all for today. This is Mr. Brass saying goodbye and get wise. Hello there everyone, this is Mr. Brass, and today I'll be discussing how the church handled heresies. Inquisitions were mostly made to deal with heresies. To us, heresy seems like a silly notion because we tend to have very individualistic, earthly-centered philosophies, which the result is of many cultural blends with numerous philosophies. All cultures have heresies in a sense, as there are beliefs in every society that is considered horrible by the majority of the population, and if you espouse them or try to spread it, you're faced with social, political, religious, or even legal actions. For example, the belief in pedophilia advocacy, aka that pedophilia should be allowed or encouraged, is generally met with disgust by the majority of the population in the US, and taking that position will likely have consequences. In the Middle Ages, earthly affairs played second fiddle to religious matters, and at this time religion was what bonded people, so to commit a heresy was essentially a threat to society and to authorities in general. During ancient Roman times, heresy was treated essentially like treason, and this held for a long time in many Christian societies. Heresies were decided on the same way it was in ancient times, i.e. from the church and the apostolic foundation. Initially, shunning was the only punishment allowed when the church was small, but when it got bigger later on, it became more assertive in punishment. This was inevitable because a growing membership means diverse ideas, some of which were against teachings. Gnostic heresy, i.e. that Jesus gave groups special knowledge of doctrines, and came up in plenty of forms over the years, and the members would get information based on how you ascended in the ranks, just like Scientology. Some groups fell apart while some stayed around to a relative degree. The Inquisition in of itself was a product of Roman law, and really became entwined with Constantine's conversion in 311 AD, which helped grow membership. Like Roman law, it was equated with treason and therefore deserved death. Donatism was a heresy that Constantine would face trouble with, as it said that priests and bishops who denied Christ to avoid being killed by Roman soldiers had no sacramental authority. Arians who denied Christ's identity also came up and became popular. Donatists could be defeated in the Christian meetings Constantine held due to the arguments from others that as long as the priests and bishops repent, they could get their sacramental powers, as because of man's sinful nature, ordination and not moral stature is what decides it. Arianism would be defeated at the Council of Nicaea, and the Nicene Creed was created. Constantine would threaten to expel Arians after they didn't change. St. Augustine of Hippo made a statement that while someone couldn't be forcibly converted to Christianity if they were already Christians, but became an error, they could be punished. Once Christianity became the majority of the population, shunning just wasn't a reasonable option, as you didn't know who to shun. Christianity growing meant heretics also grew, and so emperors who felt the truth had been clearly laid out by the church and were upheld by them, it was seen to be a heretic was to undermine the church and their authority, which was treason. By 453, it was made official that heretics were charged with treason, and is codified in the Justinian Code in 534, and being a heretic fell under Roman law, which had a magistrate who would gather evidence and ask questions on a case before judging it and rendering a verdict, which is basically what the Inquisition was. Torture was generally not thought of as bad then, then, but as more of a legal tool that was useful when you had so much evidence that the accused was hiding information or not being honest, that torture would be a way of getting it. Nowadays, we know torture isn't the most reliable way to go about that, because people generally will say and do anything to get out of the situation they are in, even if that meant pleading guilty. Torture sounds horrible to us because a lot of our ideas of basic human rights comes from the 18th century Enlightenment ideas, where preserving rights is the ideal, even if it means that guilty people will walk free. To ancient people, they were concerned about truth and not individual rights, which in hindsight makes sense with collectivist honor societies. This mindset was kept in Middle Ages with inquisitors and magistrates. By the 14th century, Inquisition practices were very laid out with very thorough manuals written. Inquisitors seen themselves as spiritual doctors who cured the sickness of societal and one-on-one heresy to save souls. This goes against older secular perspectives that tended to just say that it was the Pope silenced people who threatened his authority, which of course can't be entirely dismissed, but it leaves out the religious environment of the day in which the Inquisitors really felt that they were curing an illness and were trying to lead the people back to Christ. They used Roman law procedures in central Rome, but more common law in places like Scandinavia. At first, synodal witnesses would come report a crime they heard about through rumor or other means to the local magistrate. They were men of good reputation who wouldn't have a crime held against them if the charges of heresy they levied at someone were just dropped. The next phrase, i.e. the General Inquisition, featured the judge calling witnesses so as to see if anyone could be tried for the offense, and if there was a possibility someone could be tried and found guilty, they'd go into the Special Inquisition. In that phrase, the accused would be given a written account of charges and summoned to the court, which evidence against the accused would be presented where a partial proof is needed in the case of ordinary offenses, which required either one eyewitness account of the event or a body of circumstantial evidence. For capital offenses that had the death penalty, the death sentence on the table, that required a full proof, i.e. two independent witnesses account or a confession. If there was so much circumstantial evidence against a person charged on capital offense, they would try to get a confession out of them via the legal method of torture, which could also be applied to witnesses to get them to reveal information. The use of torture would generally last for a couple of minutes and would try not to be too painful because they didn't want a tale to come out of pain, which the person would need to tell the same story on the stand, and if they didn't, they'd have to go through the process one more time before calling it quits on torture. Torture was used throughout the centuries because it did work at getting people to reveal the truth. Once the evidence had been heard, a judge would decide if the person should be innocent or guilty. The Inquisition worked more of a same, except it didn't constitute a criminal trial, but primarily to see if someone wronged the faith. All they could really do if someone recanted is give them a penance for their crime. People generally welcomed the Inquisitors when they visited for about 2 weeks because they were seen as a man of having their sins absolved. Of having their sins absolved. Torture was pretty rare in the Inquisition court. While the Inquisitors did get criticized for their use of secret witnesses, which they themselves noticed had the problem of what if a person wanted to just get rid of another person through just wanting to silence them. If someone was found guilty of heresy, they were given a chance to recant, pay for a penance, and to help find more heretics. Prisons would be used as a means of punishment for one of the first crimes in history by the Inquisitors, as prior to them, prisons were functioned more as holding cells for a person awaiting trial, but now they were being used for really bad heretics. Relapsed or unrepentant heretics would just be excommunicated and given over to secular authority. The thorough rules and procedures of the Inquisition came from an advancement in European law and technology and theology. As said before, by the 14th century, the papal Inquisition was being used less and less, and instead was just being under the control of the crown. Well, that is all for today. This is Mr. Brass saying goodbye and get wise. Hello Hello everyone, this is Mr. Brass, and today I'll be talking about the medieval Inquisition. When the Western Roman Empire fell, barbarian Germans would set up their own little kingdoms, but they'd eventually come around to being Catholics and Orthodox. Everything fell pretty much, including Roman law. In between the 7th to 8th century, since the church was pretty much the only institution that survived the fall, the clergy would be seen as becoming part of the Roman Church, and then moved into Roman law. From this, people assumed the church had its own law with its own court. Now, how much it actually practiced Roman law depended on the location of the courts. From the 7th to 10th century, most laws in Europe pretty much worked on an ad hoc basis, as it relied on mostly illiterate people. They would go back to a more primitive system of accusing criminal laws before working to a more rumor-based system. Civil law was worse in terms of ad hocness and largely depended on the parties. Bits and pieces of what would be called the Inquisition would be seen during the time with King Charlemagne and King Henry the Conqueror, who sent out people to ask people of their kingdoms about how things were going. In the 11th century, literacy would rise in the clergy and canon law would start to be established, and this eventually led to the rebirth of Roman law. While kings and the clergy would think it's important to spot out a heretic in order to avoid Yahweh's wrath during the 8th to 10th centuries, they were preoccupied with much more important things. They were not in very good shape as there was much corruption in the church and the upper clergy were feudal lords. With all of this, people didn't like the secular laws that were binding the church, so they pushed a reform in the 11th century in order to give the church its own independence from them, along with reformed Christian society by weeding out bad corrupt officials through what you could say regulation, and made sure the Pope took his role seriously. They'd form written laws so they could combat secular customary laws, which allowed priests in many places to buy their rolls or have wives. These canon law codes were based on decrees of the past popes, the Bible, church councils, etc., and the courts would be based on Roman law. Investigation and trained jurists, along with other things required of a more established legal system, were brought in. In the 12th century, the universities were formed because there was a need for people to be trained in theology and law, which helped better them both. By the 11th to 13th century, a number of social reforms also came about, which tried to get people closer to Yahweh, to stop violence amongst knights through crusade, to get people trained with a sword to stop attacking fellow Christians but go to the aid of other Christians from Muslims, and of course through heresy. They deal with societal disease of heresy on a systematic level. Religion defied the society at the time, so heresy would be trying to destroy that society. Medieval theologians would consider the heresies they experienced as old heresies, as they could see the same heresies in the church fathers' writings, so they were seen as something the devil ordained. A heretic would be defined as someone who came willingly to hold an opinion contrary to scripture and refused to give up said opinion even after being taught the truth. In the 7th to 9th century, heresy was pretty much judged on an ad hoc basis by the local lord, who likely didn't know orthodoxy himself and not the church. During the Reform, however, it allowed for bishops to deal with it through persuading someone to recant, and that was the case in 90% of the time. Because most people in the Middle Ages had a rudimentary understanding of their faith, if they came to find out they had a false view, they'd be willing to change their mind. They were far more lenient than the secular courts, who pretty much just seen them as traitors and would most of the time just kill them. The most harshest thing the church at the time could do was excommunicate them. In 1184, Pope Lucius III's papal bull pretty much had established the common understanding of the heretic and how they had been purposely trying to spread ideas. He mentioned their biggest crimes is that they refused the truth and rejected authority. He also made it so that heretics should have to go through the church court before being handed over to secular courts. Bishops would investigate their local parishes and would see who was a heretic. This would be a launching point for the Inquisition, and it was primarily to restore Roman law, thus getting rid of the haphazard laws of the day, and to get people who would otherwise be slaughtered by the secular courts a chance to come back to the court and not go through the secular court. There was really no seeking out of heretics, but more or less just procedures to perform every so often in place known to have heretics, and a heretic would have to be accused, and if the accuser was wrong, they bared a punishment. Well, that is all for today. This is Mr. Brass saying goodbye and get wise. Hello there everyone, this is Mr. Brass, and today I'll be talking about medieval heresies and the centralization of the Inquisition. As we found out in the last video, the church and the state had much different goals in taking care of heretics. The church seen them as people who need to be re-educated so they can be brought back to the fold, while the state seen them as rebels who threatened their authority. If someone refused to accept re-education on the matters and continued to spread the heresy, the church would excommunicate the person, thus kicking them out of that community for the secular court to deal with. This would change a bit with Pope Innocent III, who would introduce the Roman concept of heretics as traitors to the Catholic Church and called them traitors of Christendom. He said they should have their goods taken from them by the secular lords, and secular lords went along with it, with some of the goods being used to fund the Inquisition. The people had very little understanding of the Christian faith, despite it being a very organized theology at the time. The church generally wasn't worried about them, as they were illiterate and were just plain ignorant, so it would be easy to just correct them and send them on their way back into society, as they would just honestly say they didn't know. The church was generally worried about serious heresies, i.e. when someone who did know what they were talking about and were preaching the heresy to spread it. These heretics would hide out so they couldn't be found out. The giant heresy group of the day was Cathars, who generally came about in the 12th century southern France because the state and church stopped being concerned about heresies. Cathars was an ancient heresy that came to France by merchants coming in. It was a dualist belief, as it held the universe was in a constant struggle between a good and a bad God, i.e. Yahweh and Jehovah. Yahweh was the spirit while Jehovah was the matter, and that we had to ascend this matter body through multiple rebirths until you reached perfection so you could go to the good God. Cathars had their own clergy called the Perfects, with bishops and everything. They hated transubstantiation, as they feel it made matter be seen as good. Pope Innocent III was concerned on the matter, as he noticed the church court and secular courts were not concerned of getting rid with Catholicism. Cathars believers could look like anyone, and only their higher-ups were more distinguished. Innocent got some of his representatives to try to inform the church in France by making sure competent men were running things and to remind secular lords of their duties. The representatives were unpopular and were blocked by both the church there and the state of the region, who didn't want them trying to change their way of life. Raymond of Toulouse VI was hostile to them and favored the Cathars despite not being one himself. He was excommunicated by the Pope Innocent in 1207 due to his inaction against Cathars, but Raymond didn't care. In 1208, a representative of the Pope was killed not that long after getting threatened by Raymond himself. Pope Innocent would declare the region as enemies of the state, as they were allowing a heresy to spread. In March of the same year, Pope declared a crusade on Raymond and all the heretic lords in the lands of the southern France. Since no attacking of Christian land was being done, the Pope said 40 days of service would be enough to fill the crusade vow. This would be called the Abigenes Crusade. Despite its reputation as being a war to exterminate heretics, it was instead just a way of dealing with bad lords, and wasn't trying to remove Cathars in general, but rather just to get the lords to take their job seriously and getting rid of the heretics. This crusade would get out of control, even for the Pope. By 1209, land in France would be conquered by the heretics. Simon de Front would become the leader of the Abigenes Crusaders. By 1215, Raymond would be deprived of his land, and his son could only keep a small portion of it. Rebellions and more problems would arise till 1229 with the Peace of France. Catharism would be just about extinct in southern France in around 40 to 60 years, with it completely gone in a century. Apostolic poverty movements would come about as well, that centered on giving up what they owned. It originally would be applauded, but a few of them drifted into heresy, along with Waldensians being the prime case. It was made by a wealthy merchant named Baldes, who lived in southern France in the 1170s. He gave up his wealth to the movement and would later on go to gain a sort of cult, which would later get the Archbishop of France to tell them to stop. Valdes, like many of the people in the area, couldn't read Latin, and thus could only read portions of the New Testament that happened to be translated to his language. His knowledge of the New Testament would be found to be horrible when questioned by theologians under order of Pope Alexander III. Later on, him and his groups would be excommunicated and expelled from Lyon for continuing to preach false teachings. The Waldensians were obviously not happy and preached against the church and would come to reject many things like purgatory, for example, along with adopt Donatist heresy. They would not gain much of a following, but their ideas would stay in some forms till about the 16th century with the Reformation and would adopt more Calvinist leanings. This heresy can still be seen to this day. Heretics were always really a minority, but their presence was something secular and church leaders worried about, so they wanted to centralize the Inquisition so as to effectively combat it. Secular courts would see that the church's use of Roman law was and integrate it into their system. Before inquisitions were very local and dealt with reports of heresies which a few bishops would look over it. In the 13th century, Roman law was being practiced not just in the church but in the secular courts as well, and there would be a centralization of the Inquisition so that there was three lines of it, i.e. secular, papal, and episcopal. The fourth letter and council showcased a centralization of the Inquisition, which is the culmination of more than 100 years of reform. The fourth letter was a massive way of reforming Christian society and restore the church from a centralist point, which established what the truth of the Catholic faith, thus distinguishing it from heresy. The 21st canon would make it a requirement for Christians to go to confessional once a year, and this was done to spot unreported sins along with find out heretics so they could be reformed. The council also affirmed the Inquisition, which was being used to deal with stubborn and relapsed heretics. Trained theologians would be the ones who determined who was the heretics. The Albigense Crusade, well done, got people thinking about heresy, which they tied into failures of the Crusades for the Holy Land, so to blame the heretics for it. The Pope of the time still wanted to reform heretics, but local churchmen and secular lords wanted to have them burned. By 1215, heretics were in organized, hidden groups, and in 1229, the council would set up a process where if the person repented of their heresy, they'd have to move in an orthodox area so as not to be around heretics, while wearing a yellow cross on them to show that they were a repentant heretic. People wearing the yellow cross were very much stigmatized. Secular courts made it so that all royal officials had to seek out heretics in their areas. In 1231, due to lots of appeals for heresy because of many episcopal witnesses finding them, Pope Gregory IX had to get a prior of a Dominican convent to be judge delegate. Dominican orders would be about by the Pope. The Franciscans by St. Francis would be established, who had no loyalty to the church courts or secular courts, but just to the Pope, and they would live poor lives while being trained in theology. St. Dominic would found the Dominicans and would create an order of highly theologically trained preachers. Dominican orders got around problems with harsh church courts and secular courts so that heretics could get a chance to repent of their errors. The Dominicans were admired in the 13th century for their piousness by Europeans, but not so much for local authorities who felt their power was being brushed aside and looked down at. Pope Gregory IX would make being an inquisitor a position, and it was always held by a Mendicant, usually a Dominican. The Papal Inquisition was the more centrally controlled, while the Episcopals and secular Inquisitions weren't as much. Dominicans would be trained theologians and work with experts in legal laws. The 14th century would see the need for a Papal Inquisition decrease, as cases were getting shorter and shorter, while the Cathars and Waldensians were both mostly gone or just in small groups, which would make it less of an active force. By the 15th century, while it would still be around, it was gone from many areas, and the secular courts or local courts dealt with it, with kings being pretty much the most in control of the Inquisitions. The Mendicants were known for their leniency, and the state hated that, and by the 16th century, after the crown had taken over the Inquisitions, the areas where the kings had taken over that role were more prone to the Reformation. Well, that is all for today. This is Mr. Brass saying goodbye and get wise. Hello everyone, this is Mr. Brass, and today I'll be going over the Spanish Inquisition. At the very end of the Middle Ages and beginning of the Modern Age, the Spanish Inquisition came about, which was highly centralized by the Spanish king, where the Pope didn't control it. It was to help Spanish kings look after the spiritual health of its people, and it was a long-lived institution that lasted centuries due to its popularity with its believers. Many Christians argue that the Jewish converts called conversos were not real Christians but secret Jews, which was untrue, but the Christians were committed to the theory. In medieval Spain, you had a unique society as due to conquest over it by the Muslims over Christians, and Christians getting it back centuries later on, made it have a cultural influence from both religions and having diverse groups coming together. Jews, after being kicked from many parts of Europe, went there, and so a large Jewish population came, and Spain became a place who at the time respected religious minorities and became one of the more tolerant societies of the day. Anti-Semitism still existed, but to a lesser degree than elsewhere in Europe, and Jews were excluded from some jobs but could become quite powerful, as some became counselors to the Spanish kings who protected them from harm. By the 14th century, though there would be significantly more tension as many Christians in Europe held Jews responsible for the Black Death by poisoning their wells, which led to Christians attacking them across Europe, with Jews being attacked by the Barcolians Christians in 1391. The attacks in Spain were based mainly on economic greed, as they didn't like how good Jews were doing, along with tales of alleged Jewish atrocities. Authorities in Castile and Aragon tried to protect the Jews to the best of their ability from these mobs. Jews who were grabbed by these Christian mobs tended to be told to either be baptized or to be killed, which many Jews decided to just be baptized. This was different than many places in Europe, as a choice generally wasn't there for Jews. The King of Aragon would remind the mobs of the long-standing tradition that forced baptisms weren't considered valid, and that Jews could go back to Judaism, with some doing so but a majority not, which could be because many of their homes were destroyed, and the thought that the act of baptism, whether forced or not, was incompatible with being a Jew. Some of the homes would be restored over time, and these Jewish converts were being called conversos, which meant they were ethnically Jewish but were Catholic. This led to an interesting phenomenon in the 15th century Spain, as many of these conversos became sort of missionaries who got Jews in the communities to convert while telling them they didn't have to leave their homes. King Ferdinand and Isabella took the throne in 1474 and joined together Castile and Aragon. It has gone around that they were anti-Semitic, but they actually tried hard to maintain peace between Christians and Jews, and there were prominent Jewish members of the royal court. They also pushed to maintain the typical freedoms Jews had in the certain towns, who overall wanted to limit Jewish freedoms. The problems with the Jews had more to do with their worry of the relationship between them and the conversos. Jews in Spain had a tense relationship with them, as they seen them as either descendants from converts who never were either religiously Jews, or Jews who had just got baptized and hence weren't real Jews but rather apostates. Some converso clergy members would persecute the Jews, thus not making things better. By the late 15th century, there was as many conversos as there were Jews, and while conversos fully embraced Catholicism, they of course kept elements from Jewish culture like the diet, and were still associated with Jewish family, which separated them from the other Christians. Conversos would be seen as arrogant, as they would claim they were more Christian than other Christians because they were blood relatives to Christ, who was a Jew, which didn't get them friends amongst others and led to Christians using anti-Semitism to say they weren't real Christians, whom were just plotting to destroy Christian society. By 1480, there would be an investigation regarding the sincerity of conversos' beliefs. Sixtus IV would be asked to confirm it, and it did so in 1478 with a papal bull. Ferdinand really didn't take it seriously, and it would be 2 years before he actually appointed anyone for it. But since it was set up, the many enemies of the conversos from both Jews and Christians came forward to call conversos secret Jews in order to get them in trouble. Tribunals were set up in order to deal with the sheer number of accusations, and the rules of evidence wasn't being used to conversos, and they were being killed. Ferdinand and other inquisitors really started to believe the false accusations and rumors that came about, and couldn't see the Inquisition itself was creating this hysteria. Sixtus tried to put a stop to it in 1482, who wrote that the Inquisition wasn't being done for the good of the faith, but rather it was for wealth, the evidence wasn't being used, and enemies of conversos were just accusing them just to see them get killed. Sixtus wanted bishops to be involved in tribunals and the accused would be given counsel, and the right to appeal in Rome would be honored. Ferdinand believed the conversos had bribed the Pope and told him angrily no, and that a real Pope would support what he was doing. Ferdinand told him that he would take full control over the Inquisition. Sixtus, knowing there was nothing he could do, left the matter to Ferdinand. Ferdinand would appoint Tomás Tucumata as the Inquisitor General in 1483, who was responsible for the execution of 2,000 conversos and was part of the worst moments of the Spanish Inquisition. Opposition by clergy in the church pointed out how the Spanish Inquisition went against every practice laid out for heretics and argued that the only thing the conversos could be guilty of is not knowing the faith properly. The next pope, aka Pope Innocent VIII, would ask for leniency and mercy for the conversos, but again, crickets. While people in Spain complained, they stopped doing so eventually, really because it was becoming too much of a risk for their health. The Spanish Inquisition wasn't interested in general heresy, but rather just simply to find out secret Jews. Conversos would basically either have two options: save their life and get a harsh penance by confessing even though they had done nothing wrong, or they could take their chances fleeing, both of which only confirmed to Ferdinand the problem of secret Jews. Generally, the purpose of the Inquisition was to see that Christian souls would be okay, and thus Jews and Muslims would be excluded because they weren't Christians, and it wouldn't make sense to try a Jew for Christian heresy. Conversos were inside jurisdiction for the Inquisition because they were Christians, and Jews started to like the Inquisition because they could by proxy kill people they considered heretics. But however, they would start not to like it once they started getting evicted from lands in 1492 because of the belief that they were trying to get conversos back to their old religion when it was actually the other way around. The decree to evict them from the lands was made clear that it wasn't because they were Jews per se, but rather they were so close to the conversos, so it was simply to separate them. Ferdinand wasn't thinking a mass exodus would happen, but rather the Jews would just convert to keep their lands, which they did with half the Jewish population doing so. The other half went to Italy and North Africa, but many would end up coming back to Spain to convert so they could get their property. The Inquisition of the past was dependent more on the unity of the church and state dealing with heretics, but with the Protestant Reformation you didn't have that, as Protestants were well organized and had favor with secular lords. Now this doesn't mean the Inquisition ended, but rather it was given a rebranding per se, which fit in with the religious violence going on. At the time of the 16th century, the most extensive Inquisition was the Spanish Inquisition, which didn't deal with heresy really, but just the non-existent problem of conversos. Because they had thought the problem was so widespread, they just stopped doing some very essential procedures that was common with earlier Inquisitions, just to, in their mind, manage it. Francisco de Cisneros was made the Spanish Inquisition General and made great reforms to bring back legitimacy to the practice, i.e. like getting rid of corrupt inquisitors, and Roman law was to be followed. This would, while not solving all the problems, would be a step in the right direction and led to a lot less people being killed over being a false Christian. This made the Spanish Inquisition of the 16th century much more mature. After King Ferdinand died, Charles V came into power and would keep this current Spanish Inquisition practices. Charles favored the Inquisition because it was answerable to him and allowed him to have royal control. By the mid-16th century, the Spanish Inquisition was pretty much unstoppable. By the 1530s, the Spanish Inquisition decided to expand onto Protestantism and similar ideas of it. Charles would expand it to the Netherlands in order to deal with Calvinism, but funny enough, despite all this due to reforms by the 1520s, the Spanish Inquisition was considered the most lenient place in Europe and Spain, and actually didn't have much of a witch craze during that time due to the rigorous methods used. During the nearly 700-year history of the Spanish Inquisition, about 3,000 to 5,000 people were killed. Because it was in such a more mature state, Spain was able to see to it that Protestantism didn't gain a major foothold there. It would get funds through confiscating property. Well, that is all for today. This is Mr. Brass saying goodbye and get wise. Hello everyone, this is Mr. Brass, and today I'll be going over some of the conflicts between Protestants and Catholics, and how they viewed each other. In the 15th century, the Spanish and Roman Inquisition would have to deal with Protestant ideas. The church and the state were in a struggle with each other as the kings developed a lot more power than they had before, and due to the church coming out of the Great Schism, Europe was divided and seen the church as needing reform. One of the best known reformers were the Humanists, whose arguably most famous member being Erasmus of Rotterdam, whose writings, while not trying to be heretical, created a following by the 16th century which was being watched by the church. He argued that the church should return to its early roots, which was largely a reaction to the wealth the church had gained. This sort of idea didn't really spread to heresy as the church seen it until the Augustan friar Martin Luther got a hold of it. He was a theology professor who valued Erasmus's work and humanist philosophy, which made him against indulgences, which wasn't a particularly new stance, as it was a common concern throughout the Middle Ages, with the big criticism being that it allowed people to not go to hell simply by paying their way out of things that they did. A Dominican indulgence salesman named Tetzel was coming by the University of Wittenberg to sell indulgences, and that's when Luther decided to have a lecture on indulgences and posted his 95 theses, i.e. the things he was going to talk about, in 1517. His arguments weren't new and were quite common at the time, and his posting of the theses was something to be expected back then from a man of his position. What made them new is in the thesis was put on a new invention, i.e. the printing press, which made him an overnight sensation partially due to the anti-clerigism of the day. Luther held that the now common but then heretical belief that works don't save you, as people are utterly incapable of truly following Yahweh's work, and that good works come from good faith. He, as a professor, had leeway on what he could say, but was asked to recant from which he claimed exemption, and said that his ideas are part of what should be a debate from which he did do in 1519 against Catholic theologian Professor Eck, which Luther lost. What came out of this debate, though, was Luther's idea that the Bible alone and not church authority was what mattered. Luther's ideas really became a force to be reckoned with, and was something the church had never faced before. He had secular lords in the printing press as aides for him. The Inquisitions proved to be unstoppable. The Inquisitions proved to be unable to stop Protestantism, and largely fell apart outside of a select few areas. Well, that is all for today. This is Mr. Brass saying goodbye and get wise. Hello everyone, this is Mr. Brass, and today I'll be going over the Roman Inquisition. In the early years of the Reformation, many Catholics at all levels were sympathetic of Luther, and said that he had a point, albeit he went too far. They thought they should talk to Lutherans. There were meetings that were held, but no agreement could be made on a reform, and the sides became bitter. Pope Paul III decided to start the Roman Inquisition in 1542, after looking at the success of the Spanish Inquisition in keeping Protestants out. It modeled the Spanish Inquisition to a degree with a less broad scope, and had the hope to get rid of the Lutheran problem. It followed Roman law and was known for its leniency, and by the 1600s it was successful in many areas at keeping Protestant ideas out of Italy. Unlike the Spanish Inquisition, it allowed the accused of a defense counsel. It wasn't until 1623 that witchcraft was made into a capital crime in Italy, and it had to be shown that a witch harmed someone. There were beliefs about witches, and people got worried about being hurt, so they went to authorities to deal with the problem, and it blew up with places like Germany and France burning witches by the thousands. Witch trials didn't really work well in many places because they didn't follow Roman law, and so precautions were thrown out the window. Roman and Spanish Inquisitions that used it had less incidences because of the focus on evidence. Outside of Italian states, it was worried that the Pope was using the Roman Inquisition to take over other areas in Italy, which led to some areas taking precautions to limit the power the Pope had. By the 18th century, due to many of the areas growing, the Pope really couldn't have power outside of the papal lands. The church mainly just focused on indexes or just approving and disapproving of books. And by 1900, when it was restored, it was just an adversary body to the Pope with no tribunals. In 1965, Pope Paul VI had changed its name to the Sacred Congregation of the Doctrine of the Faith, and the next year abolished the indexes. It had lost any of its inquisitory status for a while, and it really is just a way of members of the Pope's staff can talk theology and clergy discipline. Well, that is all for today. This is Mr. Brass saying goodbye, get wise. Hello everyone, this is Mr. Brass, and today is the last video of my series, and I'll be going over a good number of misconceptions about the Inquisitions, and talking a bit about the Enlightenment. Basically, the bad history comes from Protestants in the 16th century, Protestant Reformation. Spain, which was prosperous, was instead called evil according to the Protestants for the Inquisition. Earliest book of this trend really is in the 16th century by Reginaldus Montanus in Discover and Plain Declaration of the Sundry Settled Practices of the Holy Inquisition of Spain. It was published in 1567 and was translated and spread throughout Protestant countries. Protestants were saying that the Inquisition was a tool of oppression for them. The Enlightenment was a 17th century intellectual movement that really took off in the 18th century. There was voices of religious toleration in the 16th century from guys like the Protestant Jacobus Aquincus in his book The Satan's Stratagem. Religious toleration was also coming out as an idea after exhaustion from the very long wars between Protestants and Catholics. In the 16th century, it was argued that kings shouldn't be worried about the religions anymore. The 17th century featured more calls for toleration being made. England had the Edict of Toleration, and they saw it odd for a nation to have only one religion when that was always the case before. Hatred for the Inquisition was common, and it became seen as an oppression, and that idea only grew over time. Voltaire later on helped popularize the anti-Inquisition ideas through his writings. So overall, it was both the Protestant Reformation and the Enlightenment that started the whole Inquisition myth. Literature and other forms of media have tended to depict it as a cruel, dark, and corrupt event. Well, that is all for today. This is Mr. Brass saying goodbye and get wise. Hello everyone, this is Mr. Brass, and this is the end of my series on the Inquisition. I hope you've enjoyed it as much as I did studying it. Well, hope to see you next time. Well, that is all for today. This is Mr. Brass saying goodbye and get wise.